Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my mid-year freakout tag video. I've done this video a couple times in the past. I always enjoy it. It's basically a way for me to talk about midway through the year, what's been the best, what's been the worst, talk about what I've read this year. I'm not going to talk about every book. Don't worry about that. But, because I've read a lot. I've read like 65 books. But in the first half of the year, which is really good because that means 130 is possible by the end of the year. It's unlikely, but it's possible. My goal right now is like 115. But I read a lot of great books this year, and I have a lot of categories. I took out a few categories that just didn't fit for my freakout tag. I think that this was some of those categories were from sets of BookTube that read types of books I don't really read. So I took those out, threw in some of my own. I also added like a best of specific genres. So I'm going to go through and say this was the best in this genre, this was the best in this genre, if I've read a lot of books in that genre. For instance, I read The Help this year, which is like contemporary-ish fiction, and it's like the only book in that category really, and so I'm not going to give it an award since it's literally the only one in that. But if I've read a bunch of books in a category, I'm going to try to give it an award if possible. So let's go ahead and start with the first award I'm going to give out for this year, which is the best book I've read this year. And this was an easy answer, and that is by far Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. This is an easy best book of the year. This book was recommended by a bunch of booktubers like Brian Lee Durfee and Mike from Mike's Book Reviews and Red Fury Books, and they all gave it glowing recommendations. So I read it unsure if I would enjoy it. And I was like, well, you all talk about it. I mostly read it just because it's lauded so much. And then all my comments were like, oh, you're going to love this, dude. And I did, and it's amazing. And there were a few things, mostly have to do with worldview, that I didn't love about the book, but just about everything else in the book I loved. So this was by far best book of the year. Oh, it was so good. For my best sequel that I read this year, and this was also in contention for best book until Pillars would have knocked it off, and that's Mars Life. This is a sequel to the third book in the Mars trilogy. The first book, Mars, is one of my favorite science fiction novels of all time. The second book, Return to Mars, is excellent, but not as good. This book is almost on the level of the first book. Like, I loved it so much. You would think that bureaucracy, when it comes to figuring out how to finance a space mission, a moon base, or no, I mean a Mars base, would be not interesting. It was so interesting. I was hooked. I had to find out what would happen in this book. It was great. All right. What's my next category? My next category is the best book cover of the year. Of all the books that I read this year, the one that has the best book cover has to be Marissa Wolf's Beyond Enemies, with a cover by Sam R. Kennedy. Baen Books usually has the best cover of the year, and this one, it will be hard to unseat this book because this is an impressive cover. You can't even see like the full detail. Like in her scalp, you see the writing of like her military stuff, and you see like the details of the trees and the mechs in the background and the tank. It's such a good book. And Marissa is a great author as well. And this cover is just amazing. And this book shows up in another category later on. So most of these books are in multiple categories because they're that good. What are my new releases to be read? I'm referring to this as books that are like on my shelves that I intend to read eventually. And I didn't pull these all out, so I'll put a picture up here. I have The Silver Blood Promise, which I intend to read. I already have that for July's TBR. The Icarus Changeling, also on July's TBR. Die Young, which is a fantasy new book in a trilogy by Morgan Shank. I've read his Low Country trilogy. I'll read Die Young later this year. I just haven't gotten to it yet, but I have it on my shelves. Also, that's the ones of my new releases that I currently have. Everything else I think I'm mostly caught up on. What about the most anticipated to be released? Boy, there's a lot of anticipated releases for this year. This is the most the most books I've ever had on like a to be released pile. Like normally, previously it was like I had like 10 or 15 books that I intended that were new releases. And last year I was shocked that I had like 23 or 24. This year it's going to be like 35 or 40 that are new releases. I have so many authors that are putting out so many books. I'm trying to get to them all. Plus, I have my backlog. But my new releases, Icarus Needle is obviously very much anticipated. The penultimate Icarus Saga book. The Batman Resurrection book. I enjoyed the Batman stories, but I'm most excited for John Jackson Miller getting to write this book. That's the reason I'm reading it mainly. I'm also very much excited for the new West Wing book that's coming out. It's like some information behind the scenes of the West Wing that I'm really excited about. And then that's a nonfiction book. And then Shadow on the Smoking Mountain should be my number one most anticipated release because Howard is a great author. Howard Andrew Jones, he also wrote 2 books last year that I loved. They were at the top of my new releases list. Howard is a great author. And that should be the number one new release this year. But we have a little book called Stormlight 5 coming out, and that just blows all the others away because it's Stormlight 5. It's the end of this portion of the Stormlight archive. It's Wind and Truth. I'm really excited about reading this. I can't wait to read it. I'm super pumped about it. And that comes out in December. And so that's my number one most anticipated new release. There is another book that I think there is evidence that it will come out either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And I'm not going to specify what it is because that is a lightning rod topic. But if I'm right, and that book ends up releasing this year, then that will be my most anticipated release of the year. And I think most of you will not be surprised. You might be wowed by it. Did I make it obvious enough? Okay, anyway, if that book releases, that will be my most anticipated release, but I doubt it will actually come out. All right, let's move on to my next category. What were the most disappointing reads of the year? I've had a couple of 2-star books. I haven't had a 1-star book, which is good, but let's talk about my 2 of them that were the most disappointing. And the first one is Life, the Universe, and Everything. This book should have been so much better. The first book in the Hitchhiker's Guide series, amazing, top-tier science fiction. Very humorous, very enjoyable. The second book, Restaurant at the End of the Universe, or End of the Galaxy, whatever it's called, it was a good book, but it was not amazing. And then this book was just not a good book. There's like no plot. There's like no rhyme or reason, and people are like, "Oh, you don't read the Hitchhiker's books for the plot." The first one I did, the fourth one I did, but this one, there's just like the humor. The humor is definitely in this book, but the humor lands the best in these books when it is accompanying the plot. What makes book 1 so funny is what's happening around the characters. The jokes here just feel like they're just kind of thrown out, and the plot's just, going every which way, and it just made no sense to me. And it was very disappointing that it did not work at all. But the worst book I've read this year has to be Mark Lawrence's Red Sister. I've never read a book and just been like, I couldn't stand this like this. And it's not like I don't have things that are like bad. Like when I read 2 years ago, I read the book Shadow Moon by George Lucas and Chris Claremont. I had like negatives, like I have solid reasons why this book is terrible. This book, it's just nothing about it was enjoyable to me. None of the experience was enjoyable. And looking back at it, I'm like, I was so excited for this. I bought the whole trilogy in these nice little mass market paperback form that I love. I was like, I'm going to read the whole trilogy, bing, bang, boom, in January, February, March. And I read this right at the beginning of the year. And then I just did not like it so much to the point that I just decided to table the rest of the series. I have the rest of the series on my shelves. I do not foresee them being read this year, maybe not even next year. Maybe one day I'll eventually get to them, but I just did not enjoy this book at all, and that's very disappointing for me. All right, let's go into my biggest surprise book. And when I say my biggest surprise book, I'm not saying the book that had like the biggest twist or reveal. I'm talking about the book that I was shocked how much I enjoyed it. And the book that was just came out of left field for me. And that book is Worlds Long Lost, edited by Christopher Rocchio and Sean C.W. Korsgaard. This is a short story anthology from Baen Books. That's a science fiction. It's kind of like if there were ancient civilizations, how would we react to them through our archaeology, through other things? And it's short stories set in different universes. Some of them fake universes. Some of them are supposed to be in our universe. And most of the books in this, or most of the short stories in this book, are amazing. There's a few ones that are just okay. I don't think there's any bad book or short stories in this collection, which is very rare for a short story collection. But I was riveted by some of these stories. They were top tier. Some of the best short stories I've ever read are from World Long Lost. All right, my next one is favorite new author. This one, kind of simple. Ken Follett. He wrote two of my favorite books this year: Pillars of the Earth, World Without End. Ken Follett, it would be if anyone is able to unsee him, I will be happy by the end of the year. But it's unlikely. But he blew me away with his two books that I've read of his. He's an amazing writer. And also on that same note, who's my favorite character this year that I've read? That would also go to Ken Follett's Philip from Pillars of the Earth, Prior Philip, one of the best characters I've read this year. The number 2 character was really close, and it's from another book that I'll talk about in a moment, but Prior Philip is just an amazing character. As much as I disagree with the worldview of Ken Follett, he got Prior Philip right, and I enjoyed that. All right, what's next on my list? Oh, what book made me cry? And this is cry in a good way. And I don't cry when I read books, even sad books, but I feel the emotion. And the book that made me feel the emotion was The Testament by John Grisham. This book is a legal thriller that also has kind of a Secret Life of Walter Mitty aspect to it, where a character has to go down to the farthest reaches of the world to try to find this woman. And it was touching, it was sweet, it was the best use of Christianity in a book I've ever read this year. And I was just hooked, and I was just emotionally invested. And I won't spoil what happens in the book, but I was just like, oh, that's how you write a book right there. And no, it does not have to do with the romance. All right, what book made me happy? So, I probably made a lot of Douglas Adams fans disappointed with my, disappointing book being Life, the Universe, and Everything. But the book that made me the happiest this year was So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. This book, the plot was great. The humor landed really well, particularly because the plot was so good. And the romance in this book was just so delightful. And everything, it was just a light fun, and I read it in like 2 hours. It was a delightful read. It was, as I said, delightful. All right, and then what is the most beautiful book that I purchased this year? The most beautiful book that I purchased. That's going to go to George R. R. Martin's The Rise of the Dragon book, the illustrated history of the Targaryen dynasty. He also had Elio M. Garcia Jr. and Linda Antonsen who helped him work on this, which means probably they did actually the writing and he just copied it, or he just edited it. Anyway, this book I got on sale. They were doing a penny a page deal, and I looked at all of the categories on the penny a page deal at my bookstore, and this one fit the categories. And I was like, you know what? This counts. And so I brought it up to the counter, and they said, you know what? This counts. Good for you. I could have bought 5 of them and then sold them, but I didn't want to do that. But this book, look at the gorgeous paintings inside. And that's just one of the gorgeous pictures inside this book. This is a gorgeous book. And this will fall over, because I already filmed this video once. And this will fall over if I try to put it on the shelf. So I'm not going to. So I'm going to put it down here. So those were all the previous categories, but I have my own categories that I added. One category I added was, what was the most shocking book of the year? And the most shocking book of the year goes to World Without End by Ken Follett. There were a few moments in this book that I was like, oh, I could see where this is going. And then there was some stuff that I was like, I don't know how he's going to take that. I don't know how he can possibly resolve this. And then he just blew me away with how he resolves things in this book. So World Without End, the most shocking book of the year. Not in that shocking that I'm enjoyed it, shocking as, oh my goodness, I'm blown away by, I didn't know you could do that in the book. That is a genius way to deal with something. And then I also wanted to give a shout out for Marissa Wolf's Beyond Enemies. as the book having the best use of AI. This isn't a favorite book of the year overall, but this has one of my favorite uses of AI in science fiction. The way that the AI connects with Talon in the book, the girl, it's so good. It's so good, the use of AI in this book. All right. Now let's get into my favorite genres category, where I'm going to talk about my favorite book from each genre that I read, if I've read a lot of books in that genre. For instance, historical fiction. I've read the 2 books. I've talked about them, Pillars of the Earth and World Without End. Don't need to beleaguer that. So let's get into the other genres. What was the best fantasy book that I read this year? Fantasies so far disappointed me, but I have a lot on deck to read. But the best I've read so far this year was Dragon's Bane. This was the one, like, on Goodreads 5 out of 5 stars that I gave for fantasy. This is a great... It almost works as a standalone. There are sequels, but as it is, it works as a standalone fantasy novel by Barbara Hambly with that gorgeous Michael Whalen painting. And this is just such a fun story, and it really harkens back to that kind of classic fantasy feel that I really enjoyed. And it was a really quick read because it's only like 300 pages. See, authors, you can do an epic fantasy in 300 pages. All right, my favorite science fiction book I've already talked about goes to Mars Life. Won't talk about that too much. What about my favorite Star Wars book? My favorite Star Wars book of the year is, so far, again, this is only to June, is Rebel Dawn by A.C. Crispin, the 3rd book in the Han Solo trilogy. Really loved this. If the first book, if I just waited, I read it in December, and that was a mistake. I should have read it in January. But this book becomes the best. And I've read a lot of Star Wars this year. All right, what about the best Star Trek? I had to give it to a tie, basically. One of the best Star Trek books I read was the new release Pliable Truths by Dayton Ward. This is a fantastic media tie-in book, a great Deep Space Nine and Next Generation story. It says Next Generation on here, but it's really a Deep Space Nine book. It's a great book. It's a great book, and I will not spoil for how great it is. Also tied for best Star Trek book goes to the first 2 IKS Gorkin books. The first one's A Good Day to Die. The second one's Honor Bound. These books were so good. And they're tiny, short, read them in an afternoon type Star Trek books, but they are like together. Oh, this is how you write Star Trek for me. I'm a sucker for the Klingons, and this is how you write Klingons. All right, what about the best self-pub book of the year? The best self-pub book has to go to A Silent Country by Morgan Shank. And this is just a terrific ending to the trilogy. He is a consistent 9 out of 10 author for me. All 3 books hit 9 out of 10 for me. This has a gorgeous Jeff Brown cover. But this book was such an enjoyable read. It was the perfect length. It perfectly fit with the whole ending the trilogy. The first book was a Western that had fantasy elements, and then the second book was a good blend of both. This book is a fantasy with a few Western elements, so it kind of flips it on its head. And then the best legal thrillers. I've talked a lot about The Testament, but I also read The Appeal and The Chamber. And John Grisham has been jumping up the ranks of my favorite authors of all time. I think right now I'd put him probably around number 4 or number 5. Like, he's really one of my favorites. And all 3 of these could be the best legal thriller of the year. And they're the 3 legal thrillers that I read. And they're all top tier. Like, this year, if there's ever been a genre this year where I said, man, I'm in a reading slump, I need to read something that I'm going to love, it's been legal thriller. I can just, no matter where I am, boom, read a legal thriller and I'm off to the races. I'm loving the book. That's how good John Grisham's writing is. And The Appeal, like, when I read The Chamber, I was like, this could have been the best book of the year. And it was amazing. And then I read The Appeal, and this was also, I was like, okay, this has to be the best book of the year. And then I read The Testament, and I was like, this has to be the best legal thriller of the year. So I still have a couple. I want to read at least 3 more, maybe more, but 3 more John Grisham books by the end of the year. But so far, I would guess if I have to narrow it down, it'd be The Testament. But boy, it's John Grisham delivering. And if he keeps delivering on this level, there's a chance that he might become my favorite author. I'm just going to say that. So far, he is on that trajectory. So that is my best of, worst of, my mid-year freakout tag. If you have read any of these books, let me know your thoughts on them. If you want to do your own mid-year freakout tag, let me know. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.